Peace. How y'all doing? Earlier this year, in about February, there was a memorial service in Johannesburg at Wits University for a man called Hugh Masekela. Hugh was a jazz musician, trumpeter, as you can see in this image, or as you may see in this image. And at his funeral, artists, writers, people came in from around the world. They told stories, they sang songs, they danced to celebrate the life of this great man. I never met him myself, but to me, he's a hero. I'd like to share with you why later today. But this talk for me is kind of like my eulogy for him. Hugh was born just outside Pretoria, which is the capital of South Africa. And he grew up in Johannesburg, in a township called Alexandra. And growing up, he was always fond of music. There was a gramophone in his house and one of those wind-up ones. And he used to think, in one of his interviews, he talks about the idea that he thought that there were little people who lived inside the gramophone when he was listening to it when he was a kid, and that one day he might want to go in there and make music with them. This is one of the things that he was interested in. And this was just an example of, his love for music that started when he was young. When he went to school, as you may see in this image, one of his teachers gave him a trumpet. Not because he I guess he wanted him to explore this love for music that he had, but also he wanted to keep him out of trouble. He was a bit of a troublemaker. So he, took this trumpet, and immediately he was engrossed in this idea of being able to make music, to play the trumpet, and specifically he was really interested in playing jazz music. And jazz, he was listening to everything that he could find on the radio. At the time there was apartheid in South Africa, which meant that black people and white people had to live in certain areas. And so what that meant for him to kind of indulge more of his love for jazz and to go beyond what the radio was playing, he was crossing, boundaries that he shouldn't do, going to white folks' neighborhoods, making friends, and trying to listen to folks' music collections. In one of his adventures, he came across this movie. This is an old school movie which features Kirk Douglas called Young Man with the Horn. And in the movie, Kirk Douglas plays this trumpet player who's part of a jazz band, but also is a bit of a troublemaker. But more importantly to Hugh, Kirk Douglas always got the ladies. And when Hugh saw this, he was like, trumpet, jazz, ladies, this is my jam. I'm into this, right? Following on from his school years, he actually formed a band. And when he formed his band, he somehow, through his school teacher, got in touch with a gentleman called Dizzy Gillespie. In the 1940s and 1950s, Dizzy was at the forefront of a big change that was happening in jazz music. So at the time, jazz music was more like swing, and it was music that you could dance to. And if you were going clubbing, you were going to listen to the swing music, and there were big bands that were playing it. It was a big commercial thing that was going on. But the artists weren't very happy, simply because they were now tied to making music that could sell. And that meant that these constraints, they couldn't explore all the expressions that they were interested in. And so in between sessions, they started making a new kind of music called bebop, at the forefront of which there was this Dizzy Gillespie. Nevertheless, somehow Dizzy and Hugh started writing to each other. And so here's Dizzy Gillespie, who's in New York, changing jazz music. Here's Hugh Masekela, a teenager who is just coming out of high school and is forming his own band. And they were writing letters to each other, talking about music, talking about politics. They had to write in code because letters would be opened. And what happened was Dizzy was also friends with a gentleman called Louis Armstrong. Louis sang the song, What a Wonderful World. I don't know if you've heard that. But nevertheless, Louis was enthralled with this idea of somebody out there in the world, this young black man in South Africa who was trying to further his own understanding of music, and he also played the trumpet, so they were kindred spirits. So Louis sent one of his own trumpets out to Hugh in South Africa, and this is you may see a photograph of Hugh receiving this, and Hugh loved this. It turned out that not only did Hugh love jazz music, but jazz music loved him back. It was feeding him, and it was growing him. After school, he formed a band with one of his mates. They recorded the very first jazz album to ever be recorded in South Africa, which is fantastic. He was building his own career. He was building a reputation. He was becoming an artist. Sadly, at the time in South Africa, there was a big riot in 1960, Sharpeville Massacre. And essentially what happened was there was a protest happening. The police fired into this crowd and they killed several people. And what that meant was it only exacerbated the situation that people were protesting. And so there was curfews that were instilled by the regime at the time. And so black people weren't allowed to be seen in groups of 10 or more at any one time. So for a musician like Hugh Masekela who wanted to play, that wasn't going to happen anymore. You couldn't have a concert. which is a shame. So nevertheless, he persevered and he tried to continue his career, but that wasn't going far. Moreover, as part of his music career, he was involved in playing at ANC concerts. The ANC was the political party that Mandela led, and they were kind of the main opposition for the regime that was there at the time. So because of his affiliations, he was also a political target. And so he had to go into exile at the time. And through a set of really interesting kind of coincidences, he ends up in London for a while. That wasn't working for him. And then a friend of his invited him to New York and said, if you're interested in jazz and you want to be at the forefront of this thing, you need to come over to New York. He flies over to New York in 1967. And when he rocks up, on his very first day when he arrives, Dizzy Gillespie gives him a call and he's like, oh, you've made it. That's great. We're going out clubbing tonight. And he was like, listen, I've just been on this flight. He's like, I'm not interested. You're coming out with me. That night, Dizzy Gillespie took him to all the best jazz hotspots that were in New York. And in one night, Hugh Masekela went from being someone who had been in South Africa, learning jazz music and listening to all of these artists through his radio, to meeting every single one of the artists that he had idolized in that night, because Dizzy knew them all, he knew where they were playing, and in one night he parachuted right into the middle of this amazing jazz scene that was happening at the time. This was an amazing thing for him. It was like, he had a very lucky opportunity. And so when he became a part of this group, they welcomed him as well, saying, you're a fellow jazz musician and you're trying to make your own way. I can imagine that if it was today, they'd probably kind of be following each other on Twitter and he'd probably join their Slack group or something like that. Nevertheless, he did become one of them. And so he was playing records with them. He was kind of recording in their studios. But the thing that you wanted to do if you were a jazz musician at that time, you wanted to be in one of the bands. And he kept trying to become a member of these bands. And there were stops and starts, but he didn't actually make it. And then he met a gentleman called Miles Davis. Miles Davis recorded an album called Kind of Blue. This is the best-selling jazz album of all time, and it's the top 10 of all-time selling records. Nevertheless, Miles heard that Hugh was trying to join bands, and he pulled him aside and he said, listen, how is it possible that you've traveled thousands of kilometers to come here to New York, and what you're looking for, what you're trying to do is to become like one of the other jazz musicians that are already here. There are lots and lots of us. Why do you want to become like one of us? Don't you recognize that where you're from, your heritage, the things that you know are different from what we do? And that if you harness that heritage that you have, that richness of experience that you have that's different from ours, and you combine that with what you're learning here in New York and the techniques that we're using, don't you recognize that you could create something that is transcendent? Something that will be new for you, that will be new for us, and altogether will uplift jazz music. This was a revelational thing to Hugh. And he was listening to, well, actually, I lie. This is what Hugh Masekela was hearing. What Miles Davis actually said was something like this. Take your shit from home, put that with the shit you've learned here, and that's gonna be a motherfucker, right? Miles Davis, man of very few words, pithy words, and sometimes vulgar words. Nevertheless, when Hugh heard this changed his perspective entirely. He literally went back to all his old friends. So he was in exile at the time, but there were lots of South Africans that were around him. And he started talking to them about what were those songs that we used to sing, those lullabies, those love songs, those war songs that we learned when we were children. He was trying to revisit these things and combine them with some of the things that he was learning. That became his passion for the next 50 years. He was traveling around the world, learning all the native songs of the places that he visited and trying to combine them with new jazz styles to create jazz fusion. And I think this is what they were celebrating at his funeral in Johannesburg earlier this year. And it's one of the reasons that Hugh is a hero to me, in that he managed to recognize that something in him, something from home that he may have seen as negative or worried about because it seemed like it was on the fringe and it wasn't mainstream, was something he could harness and combine and create something that was transcendent in his career. So in this organization, and in many organizations, there is a strong likelihood that you have talent acquisition teams that are scouring the globe for people who are not like you. They're trying to build teams that are diverse, right? We're interested in this idea of bringing different people together to improve the way we are thinking and working and improve the products that we're putting into a world that is full of diverse perspectives and diverse needs. In particular, I'd argue that we're pursuing diversity of thought. people who don't think like us, whose mind's not wired the same way we are, and trying to include them in the way we're working. The panel this morning was talking about, doing these kinds of things. We know it's good. Scott Page has written a book about this where he argues, mathematically even, that there is a provable way to show that when you have diverse perspectives in your team, when you're trying to make a thing, there is a strong likelihood that you will make something that is better than if you didn't do that, right? It is a fact. It is known that we need to build these diverse teams to improve the way we are making. These perspectives, these diverse perspectives that we seek, are rooted in culture. And culture has other aspects that we don't talk about enough. We get the perspectives, but the people who we bring into our teams also have different practices, different ways that they behave socially. They also have different products from their society, so the food and the music and all those things. When we bring them onto our teams, we not only bring the perspective, but we bring that person's culture into our team, wherever that team may be, right? And this is the thing that I'd like to chat about today, because I think that we're missing a trick here in trying to bring only the perspective, but not recognizing that when we bring different cultures together, there is a possibility that those cultures might clash in a way that prevents us from getting the value that we expected when we brought that new perspective onto the team. We're bringing a whole person with a whole culture, not just their perspective. And how do we make sure that we're doing that with intent? We're doing that with the awareness that there is a possibility of friction when we do that. I was born in Zimbabwe. I left when I was 18. I went to the UK, spent some time there. And after I'd finished studying, I had the opportunity to join a small agency. That's when I learned about user experience design. And in the first couple of years, after my first couple of years, I had the opportunity to run a project by myself. It was too early for me, but I was very eager. The team was small, and I wanted to kind of prove myself. And I'm running this project, and we had a client, and I wasn't doing very well. I was struggling at the project management aspect of this. But to the best of my ability, I was reading up, and I was trying to kind of keep things going, but it wasn't working out. And I kept trying to think about, I need to talk to my boss about this. I need to make a moment that we can kind of do this. And I'd look in his diary and try and find the right spot, or I tried to raise it, but I just didn't kind of take the step to do this thing. And over time, the problem got worse. And ultimately, the client calls my boss, and he's like, do you know what's going on here? And my boss is like, there's a thing going on? And he's like, yeah, we're not very happy. And so the client came in, and they had a meeting, and everything went south from that point. They took the project from us. The business lost money. It was a small business with about 5 people. And so, a few days into that process, my boss calls me aside. He sat me down, and he said, Farai, you didn't do enough to save this project, and we're going to have to let you go. I was 22 at the time. This was like a big shock for me, not only to get fired, but also because that company wasn't just people who were employing me, but they were actually my friends. Like in real life, they were my friends. And I felt like I had not only let down the organization, which was very small, but I'd let down some of my friends. The next few weeks, everything was a blur. I was trying to figure out what was going on, what I'd done wrong, and also trying to think about, okay, I also need to pay the rent here. And so in that time, I was reading a lot, and I came across a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers. And in Outliers, he tells a story about Korean Airlines. Korean Airlines in the 80s and 90s had one of the worst flight records in history. They lost about 700 lives during that time period. This is unheard of to happen in the history of flight. And when they were looking at the black boxes, the recorders that they have in the airplanes, and listening to what was happening in the cockpit, they found something interesting, which was that there was a communication problem between the pilot and the co-pilot during that time. In one particular instance, there was an airplane, and essentially what needed to happen was that if you imagine that there's a mountain, they're flying towards the mountain. The runway is just on the other side. It was just the way the land was built. So what needed to happen is they needed to fly over, then come down very quickly, and then land. They're flying through a storm towards this difficult landing. They couldn't see out of the screen, so they were flying with their instruments, right? And so as they were doing this, as the investigators were listening to what was happening in the cockpit during this time, they hear the co-pilot saying things similar to, it's very stormy today. This storm is really, really bad. And then about a couple of minutes before they crashed, the co-pilot tries to get the pilot to make a change, and he makes a recommendation to do that, and the captain ignores him. And then about 10 seconds before, he says exactly the same thing. The captain eventually kind of realizes that, oh, something is going wrong. And he tries, an evasive maneuver, doesn't make it, and, sadly, the airplane crashed. When they were looking at all the other flights and all the other situations, they started to see some similarities. Not in every single situation, but there were some trends they were seeing. And one of those was the fact that the co-pilot and the captain were communicating weirdly. And what they found was there is something in Korean culture called a power distance index. A power distance index describes the distance between somebody and somebody who they think is their senior, and the ability for those people to talk, particularly for the conversation to go upwards. If someone is my senior, can I speak to that person as though they were a peer? Can I ask them a question? Can I give them feedback, negative or positive? And in Korean culture, that distance is large, in which case that person would struggle to have that conversation. It was so bad in the airline industry at the time that the co-pilot would carry the captain's bag to the airplane, not because that's my buddy, because they felt like that was their job, right? So when I read about this, I thought this sounds kind of similar to a situation that I was facing, where I was struggling to speak to my boss. And it turns out that in Zimbabwean culture, in Shona culture, we have a high power distance index. There's a similar thing. And I latched onto this, not because I wanted to make an excuse for the mistake I had made. I had definitely, messed up, right? But I started to understand that there is something about the way I behave that is not just a personality trait, but that there is something about the culture, about the place that I come from, that dictates or influences the way I show up at work, and that I wasn't aware of what this thing was. So I read up more about it. Power distance index was defined by this man, Gerrit Hofstede. And Gerrit had actually been part of a huge study that IBM conducted in the 1970s. 100,000 people that they had in their company working around the world, and they were already grappling with this problem of how do we get these people to collaborate so that we can get those diversity of views that we're looking for. And in doing this, he was able to define 7 dimensions. Or, in fact, before I talk about that, what he found was the idea that in a country, you will find a dominant group of people who have been born there, educated there, raised there, and likely working there. If somebody has gone through these things in one place, there is a strong likelihood they belong to a dominant group who, if you were to put anyone in that group in a situation, there is a strong likelihood that they will behave in a similar way. And that the people from Cameroon who are in that dominant group will behave differently from the people from Botswana who are in that dominant group. So between countries, they would behave differently. And he found 6 dimensions along which he could start to plot these countries to see how people would behave. These things were power distance, individualism, feminine and masculine, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and restraint and indulgence. And what they inform is about, so the power distance one is about, do you see yourself and your peers and your seniors, for example, as equals, or do you have kind of hierarchical structures where you come from? Do you think about being individual, or do you talk more about the we, being collectivist? Is your culture more power-seeking or more nurturing? How comfortable are you with ambiguity, long-term orientation, and do you seek happiness now in the moment, or are you happy to delay your happiness for the greater good or for other benefits, right? So when I saw these, I was like, this makes sense, or this helps me to understand more about my own culture. But what I was interested in was, how does this help me at my work? The power distance thing, I found that was really useful, but everything else was a bit of a struggle. I couldn't get how that was relevant to me. That's when I came across the work of Dr. Aaron Meyer, and this changed like everything for me. So Dr. Aaron Meyer is the principal at INSEAD Business School outside Paris, and she teaches business executives from around the world. And in her teaching, she started to see similar things to what Gerrit was seeing, which was that there were people who were coming from certain countries, and there seemed to be similar responses from these folks to certain situations. And so she looked into Gerrit's work, and she put it together with the work of many other folks in the social sciences who've been dealing with this problem. And she created what she calls culture maps. She wasn't the first to work on culture maps. Edward T. Hall had worked on these maybe in the 1950s and 1960s. But in this culture map book that she wrote, she puts forward these dimensions, similar to what Gerrit had done, but I found they were much more practical. They were things that I do in my job every single day. I am involved in making decisions, in evaluating, and in leading, and in trusting and scheduling. And when I saw these, I thought, this is something that could really change the way I think about how I work and can help me understand how my culture influences how I show up at work. And I want to talk to you about some of these things today. So in terms of decision making, you can have consensual or top-down decision making. And so what she's done is through her data, she's only had the opportunity to work with a limited data set, so not all countries in the world are represented on this, right? But at the very least, we can start to understand some really important things. So in consensual cultures, decisions are made through unanimous agreement. In top-down cultures, the boss or the hippo says, this is what we're gonna do. So in an example that that came to mind for me, in South Africa when I was working there, we were working on an app for a bank, and what happened was when we had finished the tablet version of the app, we did the tablet before the mobile, which was strange, but nevertheless. So at the launch, the CEO holds up the tablet app and he's like, behold, we have made the thing. And everyone was like, this is fantastic. And then he was like, oh, and in 90 days, we're also going to have a phone app for this thing. And everyone was like, yay, that's fantastic. However, we who are working on the phone app were like, we've not heard this deadline before, and why should we be hearing it for the first time in the media? Nevertheless, that's what happened. We got into the office the next day. There were lots of arguments, but then we started doing the work to try and land this thing. And we didn't make it in the 90 days. It took about 120 days, which was still a fantastic feat. But what we found was that through the work we were doing, every time we were trying to engage a different business unit, what happened was everyone would be like, we don't know about this. We're not aligned with all this. And so on top of trying to solve the design and engineering problems of landing the product, we also had to solve the business and the corporate problems of trying to get people to agree with our decision. Let's contrast this to something that might happen in Japan, where they favor more consensual decision-making in business culture. So there is a process called the ringishi, which occurs in Japan. And what happens is if a big decision like that was going to be made in a company, two folks might go out for lunch and go, what do we think? And they'd form an opinion. They'd come back into the organization and share that with lower level management. Then lower level management would come to their decision, and it will go further up the chain of command up until by the time the CEO announces a thing, the entire business is aligned around what we are trying to do. They may not agree, but they are aligned. They know what is expected, and they know what needs to be done. So that when the CEO says, we're doing a thing and pulls the trigger, the execution of that thing is going to be much quicker and much easier because we are not trying to work corporate friction. Right? We're just trying to solve the product problem, right? Not to say that consensual or top-down decision-making is better or worse than the other, but the important thing is that you need to agree on how you want to decide. In your team, on your project, in your organization, do you agree that this one person is going to be the decision-maker? Or is it the case that you want there to be a democracy? You need these three people to agree so that we can do a thing. Whatever that method is, norm it. Have some sort of a charter at the beginning. Have an agreement and say, this is how we're going to work it. And then when everyone agrees, then you can proceed knowing that we're not going to clash if we're in a multicultural team around how we're going to make our decision. When it comes to persuading and putting forward an argument, there are principles-first cultures in which when you're explaining a thing, you start with the theory of the concept, then you back it up with the facts. On the other side, you have folks who start with the facts, and then they want to know the theory later. So in North American culture, for example, if there are presentations or reports, there's a strong likelihood that when you open it, one of the first things you'll see is the executive summary. And the executive summary will say, we wanted to do this thing, here's what we found, here are the recommendations, let's get on with it. And then later on, they might say, here's why we came to this point. If, for example, you were working with a German organization and you were trying to make such a presentation, by the time you got through 2, 3, 4, 5 facts, there will be lots of hands up, there will be lots of harumphing, and people trying to stop you and trying to engage you in what you're doing. And the questions they'll be asking are, how did you come to this conclusion? Because in German culture, they want to know the theory, the principles first, right? What methodology did you use? Why did you pick that? Why is this theory correct? And then you can present the facts later, right? So these different cultures think differently about how arguments are put together. So this matters if you're working across cultures, if you're preparing presentations, and also if you're hearing a presentation, because sometimes the interpretation of that may be, this person doesn't know how to put together an argument, when actually they just think entirely differently from what you do. Another area where this matters is when it comes to interviewing. If a candidate is putting forward their portfolio and they think differently than you do, and then you might be like, yeah, this candidate doesn't know how to put their ideas together. When actually that's not the case, they just think differently than you do. So it's worth understanding the fact that different cultures persuade in different ways. In Eastern culture, there is a different thing. So what you might see here are two images. of a woman that were created by a group. So the one that is on my right here is an image that was taken by a group of Westerners who was asked to take pictures of a photograph of this woman. On the left was taken by folks from the East. I believe it was Japan. I'll need to clarify that. So when these groups were asked to critique each other's images, the North American folks were looking at the photograph that was taken of the woman by the folks from the East. And the photograph includes not only the woman, but the chair that she's sitting in and part of the room that she's actually in. And they were saying, why do we need all these things? We don't need the space. We just need her, right? And they were referring to their own image, which was critiqued by the Westerners by the folks from the East, saying, how can you just take a headshot of this person and say that you have understood them, right? We need to know that person's context. That is the only way that we can know this person. This shows a deep philosophical difference between cultures. In Eastern cultures, particularly in Japan, that are founded on kind of Confucian thinking, a holistic view is much more important. You need to know the context. You need to know more than just the subject that you are focused on. This is how you understand the person. This is how you understand how they interact with their environment. Whereas in the West, where we are educated according to Socratic thinking, we agree and believe that you can take a subject out of its context, analyze it by itself, and understand it thoroughly. Right? Again, there are merits and demerits to each of these approaches, but if you imagine this holistic thinking, and if you imagine the challenges that we're facing on our industry right now, the challenges of creating inclusive products, you can imagine that this Eastern way of thinking is beneficial to us. And when we can understand that and we can include it in the way that we are thinking, the way that we're working, we might struggle less to try and solve some of the challenges that we're trying to or some of the solutions we're trying to retrofit at this point. So this just, again, underpins the differences in culture and the differences in the way people think and how they might show up in the work that we are doing. When it comes to communicating, there are low context cultures in which good communication is precise, simple, and clear, so repeat lots. And there are high context cultures where good communication is nuanced and layered, speak and read between the lines. I left Zimbabwe in 1999. I went to the UK. I was there for about 7 years. I didn't go back for a long time. And then when I got back, I went to visit one of my uncles. And a friend of mine gave me a lift to go and meet him. So I got into his house, we sat down and we're greeting each other and everything's going hunky-dory. And then my uncle just turns to me and he says, Wawia wega. In Shona, this means, did you come here by yourself? So he says, Wawia wega. And I'm like, no, my mate gave me a lift and that's how I got here. And then he kind of shakes his head and he goes, Wawia wega. He says exactly the same thing again. And I'm not understanding, what's going on. He asks the third time, Wawia wega. And then I look at my aunt and I'm like, yo, what's going on here? What is this guy saying? And then she says, your uncle wants to know, did you bring a wife? I'm like, how the hell did we get to this point, right? Shona culture is high context. What that means is that my uncle, when he was saying that to me, implicit in his statement was, you left here when you were a teenager. You have grown up, you are now a young man of marrying age. You've got a job and a house, and you've come back to see us who are practically your parents. We expect that you are going to bring a wife. So, Wawia wega, right? Those few syllables were kind of taking all of those things in. That is high context, where there is an expectation that when I speak, there is more that is understood between us than just what I'm saying, right? Whereas in low context cultures, we want to be clear. So you may have gone to, if you are from the West, you may have gone to a course on public speaking that might say to you, to make a good presentation, first of all, when you open the presentation, tell people what you're about to tell them. Then go into your presentation and tell them the thing that you are going to tell them. At the end, remind them of what you just told them. This is a good presentation. This is low context. What that means is that we will not have any clashes. There will be no ambiguity. Repetition is fantastic, right? And these are the differences that you might have in these cultures. So how this might show up in the work that you are doing is that in low context cultures, or if you're working with low context teams, then there might be repetition of an agenda before the meeting, during the meeting, but there might also be a situation where at the end of the meeting you're asked, can you write up the notes? Can we share the notes of what just happened in this meeting? This is a mark of professionalism. Someone who is from a high context culture involved in that might be like, why do we need to write this up? I was in the meeting, you were in the meeting, we all heard what needed to happen. I'm not dumb, right? Whereas in high context cultures, not being able to be clear and precise and being very nuanced, that wawiyawega situation, if there is too much of that, teams will not be on the same page. So the recommendation from Aaron is that everyone in a multicultural team, let's just adopt and agree to adopt low context communication, which means that let's just repeat everything, not endlessly, but let's make sure that everything is clear and precise between us so that there is no nuance. There is nothing that is in the air. There's nothing that, like the French call it sous-entendu, the thing behind what you are trying to say. There is none of that, right? So adopt the low context culture. Right? The other thing that can happen, and again, this is an east-west thing. Here's the thing. So on the top, what you might see is two lines. The two pink lines might represent me speaking. So when I'm speaking, the black line represents the other person thinking about what I'm saying and them practically interrupting me as I speak. So I'll start saying something, they will start saying something, and then I'll start saying right on top of that. And so there's this overlap between us speaking, right? And so you find that in cultures like in Hispanic cultures and Italian cultures, this is great. This is a mark of enthusiasm. If I'm speaking and then you start speaking while I'm speaking, you're in it. And this is going really, really well. And so we're kind of, we're excited about and we're engaged in our own conversation, right? Whereas you might find in Chinese culture, the first person will speak, then they will stop and have a gap. It might be a very brief gap. And they will leave an opportunity for the other person to speak. And that person may begin speaking, and then that person stops. And then the other person will speak again. Now imagine there's a crossover here, right? Where you've got folks who are used to leaving a gap in a meeting, and they've flown over from China or whatever it is, they're used to leaving a gap, and they're in a Hispanic culture conversation, and they can't get a word in edgeways. And so you might have a situation where it's like, yeah, we flew that person over from wherever they came from, they sat here for 3 hours and they didn't say a word, right? What was the point of all that? Whereas the other person on the other side might be like, these people never shut up. How can I be expected to engage when they don't make space for me to actually talk, right? So again, this is a thing worth recognizing that sometimes an enthusiasm might actually become a blocker for other people who are not in the conversation. And when we are in a conversation with people who don't say anything, let us think about making space for them to have their say, not expecting them to jump in as we are used to doing in our own cultures. In confrontational cultures, disagreement and debates are positive for the team. What this means is that open confrontation is appropriate and will not negatively affect relationships. Whereas in cultures where they avoid confrontation, then disagreement and debates are negative for the team and it can be a break of harmony. So this situation where I work where there was a lady who was coming from Burundi, and she joined our team, and her lead was in a one-on-one with her and then was saying, the code that you're writing is fantastic. However, I'm unhappy because you don't disagree with me. And she was like, what? And he was like, yeah, everything I ask you to do, you just say yes and you get on with it. The work you're doing is fine. It's perfect, in fact. But you're not disagreeing with me. And she didn't understand why. So through their conversation, what became clear is that the disagreement was important to the lead because the lead was saying the very best thing that you can do for yourself and you can do for this organization is to question the things that we are asking you to do, because that is the best way for you to reveal your perspective on what we are trying to achieve. That is not to say that you must say no to the things we are doing, but when you question us and you've caused us to have to convince you sometimes of what we're trying to do, you are at the very least showing your perspective by giving us the question, forcing us to reevaluate what we were trying to get on with. So please, don't say yes to everything I'm doing. Ask me why. And let's have a conversation about that, and then we can get on with the work. Whereas the weird thing from her perspective was that where she comes from, having an argument with someone who's your superior or confronting or saying no to someone who's your superior was something that could break the harmony of the team. And she was thinking, I have done so well to come from where I've come from to be here. And if I was to break harmony with my boss, there is the potential that I'm jeopardizing my job opportunity here. And so what Aaron recommends in such a situation is role play. Let's have difficult conversations in a safe environment, right? So create that tension or whatever it is. Have those people speak to each other and have the confrontation in an area where there is nothing at stake, so that when it comes to the real world, when you're actually doing the work, you can have that conversation again, but the new person is now used to having the confrontation and understanding that it can be done really, really well. In German, there's a word called Sachlichkeit, which I've had to learn to pronounce, nevertheless. So Sachlichkeit means you can argue the idea without arguing the person. So where I work, the executives talk about if you were a fly on the wall and you could hear them having some of their conversations, you might think the company was about to blow up. They have really, really robust, tough conversations that sound like arguments, and they walk out of that room buddies because they have mastered the art and they share a large amount of trust. That means that they can argue just the idea without making it look as though anybody in that room is dumb. Right? And that's an important skill to have, is how do we think about debating the idea without debating the person? It's a skill. When it comes to feedback, there are some cultures where direct negative feedback is avoided because it can be seen as a sign of disrespect, particularly in front of the team. Whereas in other cultures, it's perfectly fine for me to say this work is not good enough. You can imagine that you're working in a team in the UK and you're working with a team in Nigeria. So the team in the UK has worked on something, they're presenting it in a remote call, and the Nigerians are evaluating it. In Nigeria, it's okay to be direct when things are not working out. So they might be like, this is absolutely off the mark. This is not what we agreed in the brief. The copy is entirely off the guidelines that we had agreed, and the interactions of the widgets on that page are unacceptable. This is nowhere near being ready to ship. Please, can you redo this? Let's have another call on Friday, and then see how close we are to shipping. If you're working on the team in the UK, you might be like, those folks are douches. I'm not working with them again, right? Whereas if we were to flip it on its head and the Nigerian team was presenting to the team from the UK, the team from the UK might be just as unhappy with the product, but they might say something like, this is looking great, guys. I think we're almost there, but I think we could make a few adjustments. I don't know if you guys have seen the latest version of the copy guide, but there's some adjustments that you can make over there. And the interactions of the widgets on that page, look, you can make the changes if you want to, but I think there's some refinements that we could put on there. But all in all, it's looking like we're almost there, so thanks very much. Right? And the Nigerians will get off the call and they'll be like, we're killing this. Right? They may or may not make those changes and they'll ship it, right? But then they'll hear later down the line that the British were entirely unhappy with what was going on, and they'll be like, I can't trust those people because we were on a call with them and they told us that it was almost okay. So why is it now that they're bringing up all these sorry, I've lost my point. But why is it now that they're saying that they didn't want to ship it, right? So that's the thing that can happen. So what we do is to skill up, think about skilling up the team on the method that you want to use for critique. Whatever that method is, right? So at Shopify, we work on a couple of these things, right? One is radical candor. So when you are doing your orientation, everybody has to read and understand this thing, right? Why? Because what this means is that everyone is aligned on how we want to talk about, the way we're working. Discussing Design by Aaron and Adam is another great book, right? Which puts forward a way of talking specifically about design, not just feedback in general, but specifically talking about design. When a team, an organization is aligned around this, it makes it so much easier when we need to talk about design, when we need to give each other feedback so that we know that we can improve what we are doing. When it comes to leading, I won't talk too much about this, but we spoke about the idea of hierarchy and how it has impact. So if you are working in a team that is hierarchical, then it is worth recognizing the importance of hierarchy in that space. So I'm coming from Zimbabwe, where I was working in a team that wasn't as egalitarian, and then moving over to Shopify in a team where everything is almost equal and your lead is almost like your peer. That was a very different change for me, but knowing how to behave and knowing that you can approach your boss in a way that is almost a peer-like is an important kind of change to understand. And in an organization, we need to be clear about that. When we bring people on our teams who aren't from where we are, we need to understand what might they be expecting when they join us. When it comes to building trust, some organizations will build trust based on, or some cultures will build trust based on tasks. So the expectation here will be that if you are good at your job, if you are doing all the things that we think of as being great and professional, then what that means is we will trust you. Whereas in other cultures, it might be about knowing you. Have I spent time with you? Do I know about your family? Do you know about mine? When we have this relationship between us, that means that we can build trust between us, and so the work can proceed. And so there was an instance where kind of American businesses were trying to go over to China. In China, they have a thing called guangxi, which there's an expectation that there's going to be a relationship between us, right, before we can actually do business. And they were struggling because they would go over and they were there for 3 days and they were expecting to strike a deal immediately, but they kept coming up against barriers where they were being slowed down, where the expectation was the Chinese wanted to build relationships between them before they could actually kind of get into doing a deal. So there has to be this understanding that trust is built in different ways in different cultures, right? And trust is important. And so one of the things that Erin has found and that she puts forward is the idea that most cultures will build trust well over food. Simple but an interesting thing. So having breakfast, having lunch with your team is a great thing to do. Beware of alcohol. That is not necessarily always a trust builder for everybody, right? So going out for drinks isn't the same thing because going out for drinks can actually be quite exclusive, right? So there are cultures where, or religions where if I can't go to a place where other people are drinking, but breaking bread, let's go and eat together, that's a great way of building trust no matter what the culture is. So think about that. Give it a shot, right? When it comes to scheduling, there are cultures where linear time is important. So linear time is the idea that we have made a plan. We are now going to execute on the plan. We will not deviate until that plan is complete. Why would we do that? Because we know that when we follow the plan, the results can be predictable. Whereas in cultures where they value flexible time, it means that we may have a plan, but once that thing is started and we're moving along, there's a likelihood that we might change what we are doing. If a new opportunity comes up, we might decide to jump on that even though we had a plan, right? Now, what folks might think about different cultures when it comes to time is like, yeah, those folks are always late, right? Oh, those folks are too rigid with the time. But there's no good and bad, but there is more just about an understanding of if we have a plan, what is the likelihood that we might deviate? So if you were in a meeting, for example, are we going to follow the agenda to the letter and not deviate in any way? Or are we going to take an opportunity for when new things come up to explore those things? Some folks will attribute the success of China to the ability, the industrial success of China to their ability to be flexible, where if new opportunities come up, they're more likely to jump on those and explore them and to see what's going to happen. That is the advantage of being more flexible versus being more linear. Less more about being late or being on time, but more about saying, do you value executing the plan and then changing, or do you value looking at opportunities while the plan is being executed and kind of deviating while you're doing that? These are the dimensions that Aaron came up with that I found really, really valuable in my work. And when I heard about these things, when I understood that I could look at my own culture through this lens, and that I could look at the culture of the people that I was working with and the organizations I was involved in, it helped me understand better how I might flex how I work and understand how other people work. This is not about stereotyping and saying everyone is the same and everyone from Germany is like this, everyone from Nigeria is like that, but it's more just about understanding that there is a base level that every one of us operates from. And that base level is rooted in culture, and that we need to learn and understand how these things work. If you are under the impression that diversity is just about shades of brown, you're not paying attention. If you're thinking that diversity is just about gender or ability, then you're not paying attention. You need to work with people who don't think, walk, and talk like you. You need to have those people be a part of how you are working. This sounds like a difficult thing on top of trying to solve the problems of designing the product. But it is absolutely critical because the challenges that we see in the products we're facing, the challenges that we see in society, are born of the fact that we have not understood what the world needs from our industry. And we have not understood what our colleagues need from us and what we need for ourselves, which is this idea of being much more open-minded about what is different in the world, not having a myopic view. This is a hard thing for us to be doing right now, but mostly I think it's hard. I would like to put forward the idea that it's hard because we haven't been doing it enough. It has always been necessary in our industry to be much more inclusive. It's just that now we're playing catch-up, which makes it really, really hard, right? The myopic view that we've had in the products and the organizations and the teams that we are making is now needing to be broadened, and that's a difficult thing for us to do. But I think there are some folks we can learn from. We can learn from these folks. We can learn from Miles Davis, who saw in Hugh Masekela, another black man, he said to him, you come from a place that's different from me, but we do the same thing. We both play jazz, but where you come from influences how you blow the trumpet. It influences the notes you're going to put together. And you need to recognize that and harness that and bring that to us so that we can learn from it and we can make something that is transcendent. And we can do the same in our own work. We can also afford, in fact, sorry, I will take this tangent. So Edward T. Hall wrote a book back in the 1950s. And a key thrust of his book was this idea that culture hides more than it reveals. And strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. That is why the thing that Miles Davis did is really, really important. When we are working with people who may not know that there is something that is hidden within them, we need to point that out for them and go, yo, there's a thing that's going on with you that you may not know about. Dig into that. Let's work with that. Let's bring that out, right? And make that a part of the work that we are doing. That's the thing that Miles Davis did that we need to recognize. And we can also learn from Bra Hugh, who, when he was given the opportunity to think about where he was from, entirely changed his vibe. He looked back where he was from and he dug into that and he brought that to the forefront. What he did that we can all do is to know our shit, put that with the shit we learn wherever we go, and that's gonna be a motherfucker. Peace. Thank you very much.